Are you tired of losing Rook endgames that should be easy draws? Rook endgames are the most common type of endgame in chess, and mastering them is essential if you want to become a strong player. In today's video, we'll break down the key principles, ideas, and must-know positions that will level up your Rook endgame skills. Timestamps are in the description. Enjoy the video. So principle number one is going to be rook belongs behind passed pawns. Whether you're attacking or defending, you want your rook to be behind a passed pawn. So what does that look like? In this case, the position is white to move, so white should play this move rook to a2. After rook to a2, white can freely push this pawn, and black is basically forced to blockade it, and this pawn that's on a5 will permanently be an asset throughout the entire game, and this is the reason why white is winning here. While this black king is preoccupied trying to win this pawn on a5, the white king will go in just like this and win all of the pawns over here. So that is going to be the general winning plan for the white pieces, to use this pawn as a decoy. So going back, this rule applies to both sides. In this case, it's white to move, and white of course wants to push the passed pawn. Let me just make a wasteful move. Let's just say rook to b2. Rook to b2 is a mistake. Now it is black to move, and black has only one idea that draws the game, and that is to put his rook behind the passed pawn, and this is the correct defensive configuration that black wants. Black wants to have his pawn behind the passed pawn because now this pawn is immobilized. If rook goes to b4, this is the only move to defend the pawn. There's just simply no way to advance the a pawn, and the position is very uncomfortable. Now, of course, as white, you still need to work very hard in order to win this, and as black, you need to work very, very hard in order to draw this. And of course, the position is not objectively winning, but white will try to push this position for a win. But the correct idea is to put the rook behind the passed pawn, and this works with rook d1 check as well, and then rook to a1. But any other move that does not put the rook behind the passed pawn, for example rook c3, loses the game right away. King g7 loses the game right away. Once again, white gets rook a2. So make sure you guys put the rooks behind passed pawns. Principle number two is that outside passed pawns are still better than central passed pawns, even in rook endgames. We know that in king and pawn endgames this is the case, but with the rooks involved it is still the case. So in this position, white has a rook on a2 and a pawn on a5, which is an outside passed pawn. Black has a rook on c8 and a passed pawn on c5. However, this pawn is simply better because it is an outside passed pawn, and black has to work harder in order to win it than white. So what will happen here is that, let's say white pushes the pawn, let's say black pushes as well, it doesn't really matter. White can easily blockade. Both sides really want to blockade, but it's way more difficult for black to accomplish because this pawn is simply too far away. So black is forced to use his rook in order to blockade, but now we have rook to a5 check. We win the pawn, and we can go on to win the game just like this, bringing the king over to h7 and winning all of black's pawns. Principle number three is going to be to use active counterplay. So in this position, white has a very active rook on d7, targeting the whole 7th rank, while the black rook is stuck on a8, forced to defend a7. However, if black just stays around and does not do anything, the white king will get in here, improve its position, and then eventually white will simply win the game. So you have to do something. You can never allow your opponent to pacify your rook like this, even if it means sacrificing your pawn. In some cases, it is going to be better to get your rook active rather than have it stuck on a8 defending this pawn on a7. So here, after a move like a5, let's say rook to b7, we can play this move rook to c8, rook captures, and we can go in with rook to c2 check, seeking active counterplay. Activity is going to be the key, and activity is what will give you drawn positions when your opponent is trying to push for a win. Principle number 4 is going to be pawns on one side of the board are usually a draw whenever you're up a pawn. However, if there are pawns on both sides of the board, now the position becomes winning. So what does this mean exactly? So let's take a look at this position. In this position, white has an extra e-pawn on e3. And what will happen in this position is that both white and black will improve their kings and rooks. The king will go to g2, the rook will go somewhere, maybe to c7 on the 7th rank actively. White will start advancing his pawns at some point, and the pawns will simply trade off. However, this position, once the 3 pawns are traded for 3 pawns, white will be left with an extra e-pawn. However, because the king is over here on g8, this will simply turn into a Philidor defense position. Now, I have already made a video on the Philidor defense, so I think you guys should check that video out because these videos are going to be connected in a major way. So once you're done with this video, definitely go and take a look at that video. And in this case, what will happen is that the pawns are going to be traded off and black will simply employ the Philidor defense technique. However, if there are pawns on both sides of the board, so in this case, white is still up a pawn on e3, there are pawns on a and b files also, this is winning because the extra e-pawn will be used in the future as a decoy in order to deflect the defense of the rook and the king and then go after these pawns on b7 and a6. This is a strategic idea behind utilizing your extra pawn, and this is why a rook endgame, whenever you're up a pawn, is winning if there are pawns on both sides of the board. This is a very important detail. Principle number 5 is going to be split pawns are weak in Rook Endgame. So in this position, both sides have 5 pawns. However, black has 4 pawn islands and white has only 2. In this case, white can play this move Rook to d6 and there's simply no way for black to defend all of the pawns. And this is going to be the case in a lot of Rook Endgames when the pawns are this severely split in these sorts of positions. So make sure you guys keep your pawn structures intact. And finally, principle number 6 is going to be to keep the king and the passed pawn apart. So the position that you see on the screen right now was actually achieved by one of my students. He was playing with the white pieces and he was trying to defend this endgame. He's about 1700 rated and he was actually unable to find the correct defensive resource here and actually ended up getting a losing position. He still drew because his opponent made a mistake, but in this position, what my student did was that he went back and forth with the rook. You do not want to be going back and forth with the rook because the black king will simply walk all the way over here and now the king and the passed pawn are going to be connected. This rook has to move and once this rook moves, now the pawn pushes. If this rook moves somewhere else, let's say over here, now the king will simply go up and the king will escort the pawn all the way over to a1. Instead of that, what you need to do is you need to be ultra precise in this position and you need to disallow the king to go over to this pawn right here. So the only move in this position is this move rook to d6. And rook d6, what this does is that it basically cuts off the king from the d file, and this is the idea. You're not allowing the king and the pawn to get close. Let's say the king attacks the pawn. Well, actually, before that, if the pawn pushes, the rook simply goes back and there is no way to defend the pawn. But if the king goes over here, now rook to d4, not allowing this pawn to push and also not allowing the king to cross the d file. And that is the main idea. If king e6, you go rook d8. If the pawn pushes, once again you go over here, there's no way to defend this pawn. If rook to d5 is played, now rook a8, and there's still simply no way to make progress, because if in this case you go with a move like rook to d6, now the king gets to the e file and it has potential ideas of going to f5. Let's say rook e5 check, king to d4. In this case, the king has to monitor the rook as well, and the rook has to monitor the pawn. So it's very, very clunky for the black pieces, and this is just a very, very difficult endgame to win because of the fact that rook is so active. And also remember the earlier principle, rook belongs behind the passed pawn. This has to be utilized in order to draw this endgame with the white pieces as well. But also try to keep the king and the pawn apart to your maximum capacity. Okay, now I'm going to show you 8 different rook endgame positions with different ideas. So in this position, black plays this move, rook to e2. After rook e2, white has a decision to make. You can play this move, rook d1, which is kind of passive, and to be honest, this is not what we really want to do. So here we need to utilize the principle of active counterplay. So instead of rook to d1, we play this move h3. We cannot take the pawn right away because we have back rank issues. Of course, we do not want to get checkmated. So we deal with the back rank issues with h3. Our opponent takes the pawn on d2. We take on f4. He takes the pawn on c2. We go rook d4. Let's say rook to c3. Captures, captures, and captures. And now we get into a position like this one where we are up 2 pawns in a rook endgame. And this is a completely winning position. So you could have played rook d1 in this earlier position, like right now. However, your position would be passive. It's still winning just because of how dominant the position is. However, what I want to teach you guys is to play actively. This is what will win you the games, and this is what will teach you good habits in chess. So what you want to do is play h3, take on f4, and then just simply trade off most of the pawns and play actively. Just activate your rook, okay? Don't sit around defending your pawns, just waiting around. Just activate them. h3 takes, rook d4 takes on b3, takes on d5, transform the position into a winning rook endgame where your rook is active. So make sure to play actively. So in this position, it is white to move, and if it was black to move, you would get checkmated. However, thankfully it is not, and we can make a luft or breathing room for our king. However, how do we do that, and which pawn do we use? Well, whenever our opponent has a fianchetto position, just like this, f7, g6, h7, we can use this g pawn to push it all the way to g4 and then to g5. If we play a move like h3, for example, what black can do is play h5, and this is just simply much easier endgame to defend than if we played g4 and then not allowed either h5 or f5. And I understand that both this position and also this position, they're both drawn. However, this one is simply significantly more difficult for black to defend. And as we talked about earlier, you need to have the ability in order to pressure your opponents into a position where they can blunder in a drawn position. Because in this case, if you go with h3 and h5 is played, there's very high likelihood that your opponent just ends up trading off 3 pawns for 3 pawns, and then the position just simply becomes a Philidor defense. It just transposes to that, and the position is a draw. However, with g4, you can put a lot more pressure, and this is how you do it. So let's say king to g7, rook c5. We're just, at this point, we're stopping f5, h5. If either of those moves are ever played, even if the rook is not on the 5th rank, we can simply capture and split our opponent's pawns, which is not what he wants, obviously. So rook to c5 played by white. Let's say rook b4, h3, we defend the pawn, and both sides are just simply making progress. I'm not going to explain each move too much. White just wants to push the pawns, and white just pushes the pawn to h5. And after a couple of moves, white is simply making progress, just like this, sacrifices the pawn on h5. It is accepted, because if you don't accept the sacrificed pawn, what will happen is that h6 will be played, and you're going to be in a lot of trouble. For example, rook to b3, h6. Now you have to go to f8. If you go to g8 or h8, you get checkmated. So you're forced to go to f8. Check here, rook h8. White wins the pawn on h7. White will be winning this game after he queens the h pawn. So that's why you cannot really allow h6. You sort of have to capture this pawn, which splits your pawns. Now we have something extra to work with the white pieces. That's the fact that the pawns are extremely split. So let's say rook to c6, cutting the king off. Very important idea to cut the king off. Rook a1. rook h6, pressuring the pawn, and then king to f4, putting the king over here, just bringing the king closer to the action. If this pawn ever pushes, the problem is that the pawn will simply be lost. Let me show you. If the pawn ever pushes, just a very simple king g4, although I'm not sure if king g4 here works because there is this move rook to g3, but you can still wait for your opponent to push the pawn to h3 and then go king g3. So this pawn, even if it's on h4, it's not going anywhere. But what white is doing is white is simply trying to make progress, just like this, king to f5, and you can see how methodically white was able to remaneuver the pieces around the pawns, the king, and this position simply gets more and more difficult. And if you just push the pawn, now king to g4 is going to be played, you're losing this g pawn, and the position is almost lost. The computer doesn't really understand it at first. As you can see, it was at 0.9 at first, now it went up to +2, so even the computer is a little bit iffy in this position. It doesn't quite understand whether this is winning or whether it is a draw already, or whether it's a draw or whether it is winning already, I should say. So you have to be very precise with the black pieces, and that's really difficult in a position like this. If I go back, I think I saw a master game, so from here there are no master games in the database, but what's funny is that after a couple of moves, after king to f4, there's a position that was played. We sort of get a position that has been played by masters. We get one game, and even though the position is technically drawn, white was able to win that game. So this is a very, very interesting endgame. That game was played in 1994. But as you can see, white is posing practical problems, and even though the computer says it's a draw, that doesn't tell much, that doesn't say much, because there's a lot of pressure that is being put on black. So in this position, white is trying to defend because black has an extra pawn, but white has a great rook placement. Rook is behind the passed pawn. The black pawns are going down in this position. So in this case, after king to g2, king g7, what black wants to do is, of course, advance the pawn. So after a couple of moves, let's say just random moves, what you want to do as the white pieces is just chill. You don't have to do anything crazy. You don't have to move the king. Sometimes the best thing to do in these types of positions is to just simply chill, because black is the one that is forced to make a decision. Now your rook has to stay on the a file. That's pretty clear, because if the rook moves off the a file, there's this rook g1 check, captures, a1 queen. The position is now winning for the black pieces, so that is not what you want to do. The rook is forced to remain on the a file. So after rook a6, the black king will try to go all the way over here and then try to walk all the way down here to b3 to assist the pawn himself. So after a couple of checks, we will get a position like this, and after a couple of moves, the black king will try to go to b3 and or will try to go to b2. However, in this case, we will not allow our opponent to actually make any progress here. We can start by giving some checks and then just simply going back, because there's nothing that black can do. There is simply no way for black to make any progress, partly because the rook is behind the passed pawn. So we have a good rook placement, but we don't also have an exposed king, because this king is on g2. The rook cannot go anywhere and give it a check without being lost. So if the rook were to move to g1 ever, we would simply capture it. So nothing like this would ever work for our opponent. This would actually be winning for the white pieces, even though black is queening. White is simply much closer to these pawns and the position is winning. But a lot of times in these sorts of positions, you just give a check, force the king out of the b file, so you force the king away from its pawn. And the thing is, you just need to chill. You don't need to do anything rash. You just keep going back and forth, and this is how you draw positions like this. It doesn't matter what black tries, we just stay on the a file. In this position, we have an extra pawn as the black pieces. However, white is slightly more active. And I wanted to include this position in the principles part. However, I realized that it's not exactly a principle because sometimes it has exceptions. And that is why I did not want to include this in principles section of this video. However, as a general rule, you can try to use this in some positions. And that is to trade off a pair of rooks when you're trying to win. You need one pair of rooks on the board. Both pair of rooks is not as good because white or your opponent will be able to generate more counterplay with two rooks. However, with one rook, white's capacity to do damage is greatly reduced. He's not able to pressure the whole 7th rank anymore, for example, and he's not able to put as much pressure on black as he could have if he had two rooks on the board. For that reason, you want to trade one of the pairs off. However, this rule has exceptions because with the two rooks, you might be able to do a lot more damage yourself, but it's sort of situational. But as a general rule of thumb, you can try to use this in some positions. You can even call this a principle. Trade off a pair of rooks whenever you're trying to win. And let's say after rook c7 here, you go a5, you get into a position like this, for example, or you can play rook d6, and then you can try to push this position for a win since you are up a pawn. Okay, now let's talk about an isolated pawn position, and the thing about isolated pawns is that they are good in the middle game and the opening as well. However, when you get to an endgame and a lot of pieces are traded off the board, they become extremely weak, and this is the case in this endgame as well. So in this position, this is just better for the white pieces. First of all, I think white can just go rook d4 and e4, utilize this pin that's on the pawn, and the position would be simply winning or actually, I'm not sure if the position would be winning, but you would be winning a pawn. It would be practically better for the white pieces. However, a better option is actually rook to c2 according to the computer, although from a human standpoint, I can even see a move like rook to d4 being played, followed by e4, and that's also just a very nice way to play this position. However, after rook to c2, king to g7, rook to c7, we also get in on the 7th rank, and the problem for black is that he has too many weaknesses. The pawn on d5 is weak if the rook, for example, defends b8. We just simply go to d7. Nobody can guard this pawn. And the fact that this pawn is a weakness really restricts black's ability to generate counterplay and to try to draw this position. So majority of isolated pawn endgames are going to be better for the side that does not have the isolated pawn, and the side that has the isolated pawn will have to try to draw the position if it becomes a rook endgame. Similarly to the isolated pawn, the hanging pawn structure is also very bad when it comes to rook endgames, and that is because the rooks that don't have the hanging pawn structure, so in this case white does not have the hanging pawn structure, so white rooks are easily able to utilize these open lines and pressure these hanging pawns. However, black's rooks will not be able to do the same because the pawns on b3 and e3 are just simply very well protected. So after rook to c1, rook f to c8, rook c5, just simply blockading. A5 is played by black. Computer suggests a move like rook to d4 in order to go rook a4 and pressure this side of the board, and a play can go something like this, for example, but you can also play rook to c1 in this position, and there's a crazy defensive resource for black, and the way you find a resource that I'm about to show you is that you need to know the principles. You need to understand the principle of active counterplay. The best move in this position is actually not a very intuitive move, and it is rook f to b8, giving up the pawn, because you're gonna lose the pawn regardless, right? Because you cannot defend it with rook a6, because then you lose the pawn on d5, because there's a pin on this pawn, and you would lose the rook on c8. So you cannot exactly just go rook a6. This pawn is going to be lost. So the best thing to do for black is to go rook b8, give up the pawn right away, and just go a4 and go with active counterplay. So this is what black wants to do in this position also. So you guys need to keep these principles in mind, and also you need to keep in mind that if you have the hanging pawn structure, try to keep the pieces on the board and do not go into a rook endgame. Okay, now I will show you this position right here, and I know I have queens on the board, but let's just make a couple of moves. Let's just say queen d1, taking the whole d file, and both sides are just simply playing improving moves. And after queen to f3, let's say black decides to trade the queens off and go into a rook endgame. Now the problem for black here is that white is just simply going to be more active, and this is a very difficult position to defend. So white plays a move like rook to d7, and after king e8 goes rook to b7, maintaining pressure over here. Now if black chooses to create active counterplay, in this case let's say rook to d8, there is one unfortunate problem for the black pieces, and that is that this pawn is on a4. So after rook to b7, rook takes b2, we can play this move a5 and utilize this pin. And this is quite a common, I wouldn't say a common idea, but it is an idea that happens, of like a scenario like this where one side is attacking a pawn, the other side is defending the pawn, and you have an adjacent pawn that's trying to sort of utilize this pin just like this. And in this case the position is winning, because either you have to lose the pawn on b6 or you have to allow this pawn through, which would be devastating for the black pieces. That is definitely not what you want to do. If we were to change the position a little bit though, just going back here, let me show you the starting position. This is the starting position, and now we're gonna go to this position right here. It's exactly the same, except the pawn is not on a4, it is on a3 instead. I forgot to close that. Let me close that. And if we make the same sequence of moves here, this changes the position drastically, and it's actually no longer winning for the white pieces. Now black can employ active counterplay, and then after white takes on e7, after rook to b2, now there's no rook to b7 because simply captures here, and if a4, this doesn't do anything. There's no threat here for the white pieces. White is not creating any threats, so this position actually straight up just becomes a draw. So you guys need to be aware of these sort of pin ideas where one side can use the adjacent pawn or the pawn that is next to the pawn that you're trying to win to utilize the pin and to win more material. And lastly, we have this position right here, and the idea that I want to show you guys is that you don't need all of these extra pawns. In reality, to win a chess game, you only need one pawn. One pawn is enough to win this game. And what we can do as the white pieces is just simply go king to g7, give up the pawn on a5, and then we can also give up the pawn on d5. We give a check on e2, and now this position becomes Lucina, and we know that Lucina position is theoretically winning. What is the Lucina position? It is what you see on the screen. The rook is cutting off the black king, and the white king is next to a passed pawn. And now I'm not going to show the winning techniques in this position, because once again I already showed that in another video, so I will simply put that video in the description. I will also put it on the end screen. And what I want you guys to understand is that you don't need all this material. You only need one pawn, and if you know that this position right here is theoretically winning, I want you guys to be confident into going in this position and then using the winning techniques to promote the pawn and then win the game. So this is what I wanted to teach you guys today. I hope you enjoyed today's video, and watch the Lucina and the Philidor defense video, because it has a very, very close connection. A lot of positions, as you can see, they go from just a normal rook endgame position into a Lucina very quickly, or you can push a position into a Lucina, or if you're trying to defend, you want to try to push the position into a Philidor. So you need to know all the ideas that exist in Lucina and Philidor in order to accomplish that. So that's gonna be it for today's episode. I hope you guys enjoyed this, and I will see you in the next one. Peace.